So first of all, thank you guys very much for joining in today. The purpose of the call is to discuss applying for our non-point source program grants. So we have the Section 319 and the Section 205J funds that we're going to be talking about today, and the applications and materials for those. Anytime, feel free to jump in with questions. You can either unmute yourself or post into the chat function. Since we're a pretty small group today, please feel free to unmute yourself. There's also, I believe there might be a raise hand feature. I might be making that up. So if you want to use that, feel free, but otherwise just go ahead and hop right in. So we're going to move right on. So this training is associated with the FY2022 federal fiscal year. My contact information is there for you if you'd like to get a hold of me at any time. My name is Alex Jeffers. I'm fairly new to the program. This is my second time presenting on this training. Been with the DEQ for about a year. Really happy to work with you guys. Looks like we have some folks that are have ongoing projects, and then maybe somebody that is interested but not quite in a project yet. That's really great. So I thought what we could start off with is just introducing ourselves. And you guys, please forgive me if I get a little off track too. I'm letting people in as we discuss. So anyways, let's go back to our presentation. Couple housekeeping items. Please mute yourself on your computer audio or your phone when you're not speaking. This will just help with any feedback that we might see. Again, feel free to send any questions via the Zoom chat, but we have a small enough group today that if you want to just unmute yourself and chime in, that works out great to me. And then I'll also be trying to monitor my email. So feel free to send feedback to my email during the course of the presentation or after. And as a reminder, you're going to see it on every slide. This webinar is being recorded, so this will be posted up later on for your viewing if you need it. All right. Let's see. All right, so again, the purpose of the webinar. So we're going to provide some information for those of you that are interested in submitting a FY22 proposal for our grant funding opportunities. This is a great opportunity, again, for some Q&A, either general about the grants or the application process, or maybe even project specific. So if you have a project in mind and you're working on the logistics, this is a great time to go ahead and bring those questions up. Due to how competitive our grants have been over the past few years, we are no longer providing a pre-review opportunity for draft proposals. Many of you are likely familiar with that. That's been the case for a number of years, but wanted to mention it again. So with that in mind, just remember that questions after today's webinar in regards specifically to applications will be limited. I wish I could go through and answer everyone's questions and review all of the drafts, but unfortunately, we're just not able to do that at this time. So again, no question is a bad question. Let's feel free to ask me now. Okay, let's see. So here's some more information about what we're going to cover. And again, if I quit talking, I'm just letting somebody in from the waiting room. So we're going to talk about the Section 319 and the Section 205J grants. So we're going to talk about information that's required in the proposal for both of those grants, how to submit a proposal, different tips throughout the call today on how to submit a competitive proposal. And then we'll look over the process and the timeline for the application. So there's a number of steps, and we'll go through all of those things today. Okay, so many of you may be familiar, but we have 2 federal grants available through the DEQ Water Quality Division, specifically the Non-Point Source Program. Both of these grants are awarded to the state under the Clean Water Act by the EPA. And they're targeted to address non-point source pollution. So those of you that aren't familiar with non-point source pollution, just a quick definition for you. So we've got point source pollution, which is exactly what it sounds like. We can kind of point to the source, if there's a pipe in the water or in the watershed that is contributing pollution to the watershed, then that would be a point source. Non-point source pollution would be those that aren't as easily pointed to. So very easily named. And then, if you have further questions on whether, the pollution you're looking at would qualify as non-point source, just feel free to reach out to me. There's also more information on our website. So Section 319 grant, those are going to be projects that will reduce non-point sources of pollution to surface water and groundwater. Those would be on the ground, boots on the ground types of projects, typically. For Section 205J grants, those are primarily non-point source water quality management planning projects. So those are limited to planning, and we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. So just as a quick recap, Section 319 is typically on the ground, and then Section 205J is not boots on the ground types of work. That's more planning. And then the next thing we're going to just dive into before we talk about the specifics is where can you find this information when you're ready to see it. So everything's going to be on the Non-Point Source Program Grants Resources website. There's a link here. It's really easy to navigate to. If there's time at the tail end of the presentation today, I'd be happy to walk you through those and how to find each specific item. For each grant, we're going to have a memorandum, which is the announcement of the request for proposals and then the guidance for applying for the grant. And then there will be an application form. The application form is a fillable PDF form. It's very condensed and streamlined. So hopefully that works well for you all. Welcome to hearing feedback on any aspect of these items if you have it. So continuing for FY22 again, we've got that shortened and streamlined application form, and then we'll check out the website if we have a little bit of time on the tail end. So what else do you need to review when you're getting ready to potentially come in for an application? So the first thing would be the link to the Sage Grouse Data website. That would be in the memorandum in the RFP. So if you can't find that link, just let me know. It's pretty prominently displayed on there, but it might, if it gives you any challenges, that's what I'm here for, to help point you in the right direction. The big thing to know about the Sage Grouse Data website is if your project is in a sage grouse core area. So if you're in that core area habitat, then there's an extra step with the game and fish that you would want to go through that we'll talk about here in a little bit. You also likely would want to view the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning. There's 2 different documents on our website this year. One is a more condensed format of those 9 key elements. And then there's also a Word document that walks you through in more detail. This is really important, especially if you're not sure if you have a watershed-based plan that you are going to apply to your project. And it's just critical across the board to make sure that any planning documents you're using would meet those 9 key elements. The watershed-based planning summary is really helpful for those of you that may not be familiar with what watershed-based plans are out there. That's updated on a yearly basis. So as we get new planning documents in, you can go onto that document and look to make sure that your water body has a watershed-based plan, or if it would need one to qualify for applying. You'll also see the FY22 section 319 evaluation and scoring sheet on there. We'll talk about that in a little more detail here in a bit. Same thing with the FY22 section 319 proposal review guidelines. Those are going to be a list of guidelines that our task force are going to use when evaluating your project. And so really important to check all of those things out. Make sure you're familiar with what our task force is paying attention to and what elements are required for applying. Okay, so here is a very general timeline for the application process. So hopefully you all saw that the RFP was issued last week on July 9th, or yes, last week before. And after that, about a week after that is when we typically will have our training webinar, which is today. Then on September 10th, that's when the final proposals will come due. We'll go over that in more detail here in a minute as well. And then mid-September through October, once we receive those proposals, I'll review them and then I'll send the evaluation section of our scoring process off to you guys to review my comments. And then I'll send those also to the task force. And when I send them to the task force, I also will send your application to them as well. So that's kind of when they'll get that mid-September through October. And then late October to early December is whenever we have our task force meeting. At that meeting, we will host presentations for all of our applicants. The task force will be there present to see those presentations, and it's a really great opportunity to showcase everything your project's about, answer any specific questions from the evaluation phase, so that they can take that presentation into account with your application. And then after that, once they have made their funding recommendation, in about spring to summer of 2022, depending on federal allocation, we'll start seeing the funding become available through EPA, and then we'll go ahead and start issuing agreements for FY22 projects. All right, and this all will kind of go into a little more detail here in a little bit. Okay, so I'd be remiss if I didn't give this disclaimer to you guys. So the amount of funding that we have available and the timing of the release of those funds is wholly dependent on the congressional and presidential federal budget approval process. It does vary year to year. And basically we're kind of held to that. So just keep that in mind. Any updates that we have throughout the process will be distributed via the non-point source listserv. If you aren't already on the listserv, here's a link here, but I can also on the tail end of the project or on the tail end of this presentation show you where to find that directly on our website. Okay. So with that, I'm going to take just a quick break to see if you guys have any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop it into the chat. If you don't have any questions, we'll keep going. All right. All right, guys, well, we'll keep going, trucking along here. This next part, I'm sure will generate more questions than this last part. So we're gonna get more specific now. We're gonna talk about section 319 proposals specifically. So we'll talk about section 319 and then we'll move into section 205J. All right, so section 319, again, the goal is to reduce non-point source pollution or to protect or improve water quality. This grant is reimbursement only, and at least 40% of the total project cost must be non-federal match. Oh, okay. Carlin, that's totally fine. I'm going to pause here and answer this question. So Carlin popped into the chat and asked, what is the current criteria for 319 funding in respect to having watershed plans in place? So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. That is an excellent question. So our Section 319 projects are required to have a DEQ approved watershed plan in place. If there is not one, then there is an opportunity in very limited case to look at an alternative plan. So the alternative plan can be submitted to me prior to submitting your application, but I have to review it and make sure that it meets the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning prior to your application. So if you have a project in mind that you're not sure of if it may meet the alternative planning requirements, or if it doesn't have a watershed-based plan, feel free to give me a call on that one. That's something we can look at together. That's a great question, and we'll touch on it here in a little bit too. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so another biggie to keep in mind for Section 319 projects. This is all voluntary. And again, since it's reimbursement only, we can't give out funds ahead of time. Basically, we have to have proof of the work being done prior to submitting payment or giving payment. We're going to keep going here. So here's some more information on the eligibility for Section 319 specifically. Again, Section 319 funds are typically used for on-the-ground work to improve water quality. Just as many of you are likely aware, if there is increased production as an outcome of the project, that is a wonderful co-benefit of it. While water quality improvement is our primary goal, increased production as a co-benefit makes it a win-win for your producer and for water quality. And that can oftentimes be a great in for your landowners too, to get more projects going on the ground. So more details on eligibility. So again, those projects that demonstrate the real potential to improve water quality by reducing non-point source pollution are eligible. These may be watershed restoration projects, which are most common and higher ranked or higher prioritized. Then we have watershed protection projects, still looking at boots on the ground projects, but maybe on unimpaired water bodies instead of impaired water bodies. Other lower priority projects would be outreach and education, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater. So typically, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, they do rank out a little bit lower, those last few, but they are eligible, and some of these can actually be applied to Section 205J funds as well, as you'll see. So there might be some opportunities in both grants. So typically there's a broad eligibility, but again, just make sure you familiarize yourself with the program priorities, because that's what the task force will be focusing on as they review your application. So things that are not eligible would be research, regulatory actions, or response to regulatory actions. Point source projects, primary benefit is increased production. Again, if increased production is a co-benefit to the project and water quality improvement is the primary goal and the primary outcome, that's a wonderful win-win in the watershed for that producer and for water quality. So that is a good thing. Purchase of real property, so real estate purchases, is ineligible, and then anything that would be in violation of local, state, and federal regulation is also not eligible for funds. Okay. Okay, so who can apply for Section 319 funds? So this is a little bit of an older graph, but again, there's a very broad eligibility for who can apply. The only thing to note is that projects that are submitted by individuals, that's limited to demonstration projects only. But as you can see, conservation districts have been our primary sponsor, primary applicants for Section 319 funds, followed by nonprofits, cities, the University of Wyoming, state agencies, boards and associations, towns, private entities. So typically those would be the individuals. But then we also have had county and federal partners as well, or sponsors as well. So very broad, but there is a bit of a trend on who is applying year to year. All right, so how much funding is available and how much should I apply for? That's a great question. This year, we estimate that a maximum of $967,000 could be available for projects in FY22. I will disclaim there that this is an estimate based on last year's award, and so it does vary year to year. However, we did get some positive feedback from the presidential budget that was since passed on to Congress. So we're getting that, we're still kind of pending that congressional approval, which is where things may change. But again, we're optimistic. We think we might get around the same amount that we got last year, which is great. Typically, we account for less, but this year I'm feeling fairly confident that we can count on getting the same amount as last year. So with that said, there's no maximum project amount cap. So you can apply for as much of that available funds as you want. Just keep in mind that typically our projects are funded from a range of about 20,000 upwards to no greater than 400,000. Our task force does like to distribute those funds across multiple projects. So it would be very, very atypical for them to recommend funding the full amount of funding to one project. So be sure to request what you need for your project, but try and be as cost effective as possible. A really common way that I've seen for people to do that for higher, more expensive projects has been to phase that project and come in for subsequent years of funding. I will say that, if you do come in for more, or if the task force thinks there might be an opportunity to phase your project, they will ask you. So be prepared for that question, should they ask. And then the other thing for this year that's a bit unique is we may have additional leftover FY20 funds available for one project. So those funds are coming available from a project that closed early. And so the consideration there is basically going to be a bit of a different timeline. So these funds would expire a little bit sooner than say the FY22 funds would expire. So we'll be sure to have that discussion, but just keep in mind, if you have a shorter timeline, there may be opportunity for additional funds there for you. All right, so here are the priorities for Section 319 funds. High priority projects are going to be watershed restoration or projects that implement on the ground conservation practices to restore impaired water bodies. So keywords are on the ground and impaired for high priority. For our high priority projects, watershed-based plan or an alternative plan is required. So your project will not receive funding if we don't have one of those mechanisms in place. Then same thing goes for watershed protection projects, which would be medium priority. Again, keywords there are on the ground and unimpaired. So the big thing to note here is that the on the ground part is kind of what justifies needing a watershed-based plan or an alternative plan. Because as you can see in the low priority projects, those planning documents are no longer required. So those types of projects for low priority are going to be outreach and education, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater. Again, those are low priority for 319, but some of those have applicability to certain entities to our 205J grant. So there may be some opportunity on both ends of those too. So if you're questioning which bucket you fall in, 319 or 205J, that's a great question to ask today. So for low priority projects, we recommend to limit those to $50,000 or less. Since they are lower priority, they typically don't receive a higher percentage of funding than $50,000. Let's see. So to find out if you are wanting to implement, if you're not sure yet, on an impaired water body, you would likely need to refer to our 303D list on our most recent integrated report. That is also on the DEQ website, so I can point you to it if you need it. And again, those low priority projects, just to throw this out there, it doesn't mean that they're not important. They just rank out lower due to our state and federal water quality priorities, right? So our priorities typically go to impaired water body restoration. And we have that written down, and that's the only reason. So if you do have a lower priority project, I recommend still considering applying. Okay, so watershed-based planning. So Carlin, hopefully this will give you a little bit more insight on what you might be looking at for maybe your project idea. So watershed restoration projects must be implemented in accordance with the watershed-based plan. Same with watershed protection projects. So those that are approved by the DEQ for use in these types of projects typically are going to be the 9 key element watershed-based plans. So they meet the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning as outlined by the EPA. If you have written a watershed-based plan that does meet those 9 key elements, you likely already know that. But if you're not sure, now's a great time to ask. Again, those are on the ground work on an impaired water body, which are restoration projects. Let's see. Okay, so some other just brief details. These 9 key elements are requirements, again, set at the national level by the EPA. And basically it just says that these plans have to have elements included in them pointing to on the ground projects. And oftentimes, but not completely, this may be done through the TMDL process. So a lot of times our approved TMDLs meet the 9 key elements and could be a watershed-based planning document. But they're often also written by conservation districts, coalitions, watershed coalitions, outside of the TMDL process. So those are our most common. There's more information on our website on this. So we have the 9 key elements of watershed-based planning documents. Again, there's 2 up there now. And then there's that watershed-based plan summary. And if we have time at the end, I'll show you those. So kind of the big thing to note here is if you're unsure, please contact me as soon as possible so we can go through that and see. Once we get closer to when the applications are due, we may be fairly limited in what we can do if alternative plans are needed. So please reach out early and often. Okay, so I did mention alternative plans. And again, in very limited cases for watershed restoration or protection projects, an alternative plan may be accepted. So if we have emergency situation or a very small scale problem, those are more common to be accepted, but it still doesn't hurt. If you don't have a watershed-based plan that's been approved and you think you meet those alternative planning requirements, reach out to me and we can see. The big thing here is, it does take time to go through that process and see if you have the alternative planning that you may need. And so we can't guarantee enough time to go through that process before applications come due. So watershed protection projects at a minimum would require an alternative plan. It's fairly atypical for an unimpaired water body to have a watershed-based plan tied to it. So this is probably going to be the most common, at least from my experience of what we see, are those very limited instances where we have a watershed protection project that doesn't have a watershed-based plan. So for the alternative planning requirements, you can see them there. We basically need those elements to review, and the documents can be anything from water development studies to city and county planning documents. The goal or the bottom line there is they don't have to be a standalone document. It can be a collection of planning documents, like the ones I mentioned. So you guys all know now, call me if you think you have an alternative plan and we will review that together. Okay, so what do I need to submit for a 319 proposal? You'll need to submit an application form, which I'll show you that in just a moment, a project map or maps, and then the Sage Grouse Court area consultation letter if applicable. We ask that you do not include any other attachments like letters of support or the Excel budget workbook. Those have been removed from the application process when we did work to streamline that. Just know that if you are recommended for funding, that's when we'll kind of go into more detail. So we'll work together to pull together what's called a project implementation plan or a PIP and a budget. And those I will assist you in creating. We've got templates for that. But the biggie here is that the task force really only wants to see that streamlined information that's being requested in the proposal. So no need to go through any additional items there. There is an area, as you'll see in the application, for you to provide further information. So I'll show you where you can put that if you'd like. Okay, so the Section 319 application form is a 9-page fillable PDF. The format is set, so please do not modify that. If you do, it may not qualify for funding. So we really want to make sure you guys are using that. You'll want to use Adobe Reader, which is a free download. And right there in the application form and in the RFP is a link to download that. So if you're having trouble with that part, please give me a call and we can work through that. You're going to want to download the document to your computer and save it in a location that you can find. And then after that, you can start editing and saving it. This is really important so that you don't lose your application if you're midway through filling it. I know you can fill it in on your web browser, but again, after you fill it in on your web browser, you would have to download it anyway. So it's better to just go ahead and do it at the beginning. If you're using a Mac, be sure that you open it with Adobe and not Preview. Preview has been causing some complications to the functionality of the fillable PDF. So it's always important to just double check to make sure you're in the right application. Okay, so this next part is what basically the first page of the application looks like. For the project title, you'll need to write the title many, many times throughout the life of the project, including in the beginning and just throughout implementation and then closing it out. So I recommend that you save yourself some grief and keep it brief, as brief as you can, to show the specifics of what you're accomplishing. And then in the project synopsis, it's really important here to describe it in public friendly terms, what you're trying to do with the project. If this is the only thing that someone would read, what would you want them to know? This synopsis may be edited and used later on in reporting. So just be sure that you're capturing the goals and description of your project in a concise way that anybody could understand. And then for applicant information, this is going to be the entity that the DEQ enters into the legal agreement or the cooperative agreement with. So whoever that may be sure to put it there. It seems like more and more we're seeing folks collaborating on projects. So just know that if you're, for example, if you're a conservation district and you're going to collaborate with another conservation district on the project and you're going to somewhat co-sponsor it, here you would only want to list one of the conservation districts. So that can be yours or your partner district. So beyond that, you'll see, let me back up here. So in this next section, you'll see HUC 8. HUC stands for Hydrologic Unit Code. Feel free to give me a call if you're not sure what your HUC 8 may be. You can also use the EPA's How's My Waterway tool, which is really useful to find that information. We also have, through our assessment program, a wonderful map that you can figure out your HUC 8 for your impaired water body pretty easily on. So if you're interested in using that, I can show you where to find it. But again, if you're not familiar with impaired water bodies or your HUC, please give me a call and we can walk through that together. Because as you can see, you will need to list those water bodies and then state whether or not they are impaired. And then that last little part of the application, or this first page of the application, is just checking off that you have included a project map. So that is required. And just a quick note on the map itself. There are some specifics to read through on what you should include in your map, but basically just be sure to include relevant information so that the task force can easily point to where your project may be. Okay. Moving right along to this next page. So as another disclaimer, funds will not be available until the spring, summertime of 2022, depending on when we receive congressional budget approvals. The grants are open for 4 years. So really we have 5 years for the life of the grant, but projects are limited to 4 years to ensure that we can wrap up all of our reporting with enough time for each grant closure. Sometimes acronyms and technical terms are needed to describe your project, but again, just as a note, please try and be as clear and understandable to a general public as you can. So any acronyms that you may use, try to write them out the first time and then give the acronym, and then you can refer to that later on. So again, there's a note here that funds will not be available until that spring, summer of 2022. And then we do have a hard stop for our end date based on the grant closure. So that would be, looks like this year, November 2026. All right, and then in the project purpose section, just write about why your project is important, why should it be funded, and again, speak in those terms that are understandable to the general public. All right, so the project scope is where you will describe what the project will do to address water quality problems. So there's a big emphasis there on the word do. These are very action-oriented projects. So try and be as specific as you can. If you're familiar with SMART goals, that's a really great format for you to think about using. And, you know, as specific as you can, you know, we want to do this objective and these are the outcomes for it kind of thing. And if you can provide estimated load reductions or estimated amounts of, you know, smaller projects, those are kind of the detailed specifics that the task force will be looking for. So just for example, something you would not want to write would be something along the lines of, I hope to improve water quality through agricultural BMPs. That's a little too broad. So try and be specific on what agricultural BMPs you're going to specifically do, how many you're going to do, what do you estimate the load reductions to be if you can, those types of things the task force would like to see. They basically want to see that you've done your homework. And then in your project plans, what we're looking for here is your roadmap for your project. How do you know what you're going to do is going to be effective or not? These plans typically will give you goals for that and give you a baseline of measurement for the success of your project. So you can refer to the previous slide, the memo, and then the documents on our website for more info on, again, those watershed-based planning requirements. But if you have any questions specifically on that, please give me a call. Okay, I am going to go ahead and do those two. So for project outcomes, just to give you guys more detail here, again, we want to get really specific, and I might have gone a little too far on the last slide. Here is where you would want to list out your tangible products, your outcomes, and your deliverables, the environmental benefit, and you would like to be product oriented rather than process oriented. In this section, in the section prior that we were just talking about, is where you can be a little more detailed in the process. So the reason why we're looking at that is that the non-point source program as a whole is held to an environmental measure of success. Basically, we have to be more specific than we're going to improve water quality. We need to see what pollutants, how much of those pollutants that we're reducing, even if it's just a rough estimate. So consider what exactly you're going to implement. So for example, you know, my conservation district plans to fix 4 septic systems, 2 areas of wetland complex, X amount of riparian fencing, etc. And then in the project evaluation section, this is going to be really critical too. This is another aspect that of 319 that's really critical for our measuring our success, because we're ultimately held to measuring specifically the water quality improvements when we report back to the national level. So I think right there we'll kind of stop on that page and move on. Yes, okay. So more specifics for evaluation and monitoring are here. For a lot of us, especially if we're resource limited, funding limited, personnel limited, evaluation and monitoring can be very challenging. However, it's very important and actually a mandated component of our 319 grants. In general, data packs a very powerful punch when we're trying to evaluate the success of the water quality improvement projects that we're doing. Basically, we can say the data says we did improve water quality, and anecdotally shows that projects are working. Ultimately, we're trying to get to watershed restoration and removing our impaired water bodies from the 303D list. Data does show improvement, whereas restoration may take a long time to show. So, that photo point monitoring, for example, is really important because that's over time, you can see visibly the changes in the project site area. But if you're collecting data, you may be able to point to those water quality improvements faster, more definitively than relying on just one monitoring component, if that makes sense. So with that said, we all do know again that there are circumstances where monitoring may not be an effective use of funds. So for example, maybe the project implements BMP for which alternative methods of monitoring are more appropriate. For example, maybe modeling is more appropriate. Maybe the project is in a watershed where the sponsor believes it's most appropriate to implement several phases before effectiveness monitoring is warranted. So it may not be the most applicable in that phase to collect monitoring data. Another example would be if the project implements BMPs for which it is believed that several years, basically beyond the scope of the proposed project, will be needed to realize water quality improvement. And as most of us likely know, that can be the case for a lot. And then it's also important to note that if there are safety issues that preclude monitoring, we don't need to be out there monitoring if it's an unsafe condition, or if there are other circumstances where the sponsor can justify that water quality monitoring is not the best use of funds, those will also be considered. So in short, we really want to get that data as often as we can, but we do recognize that there may be times when specifically water quality data collection may not be the answer. And it might be that it's a combination of the things. So our memo, the RFP memo does go into detail more on that if you have further questions. Okay. So some more information on evaluation and monitoring. It's really important to, when you're thinking about how you want to conduct your monitoring, specifically for 319 projects, that you think very strategically and creatively about what success may look like for your project. How would you communicate success out to the public that you, whatever you went out to do was done? So keep in mind for section 319, the broad definition of success looks like watershed restoration. So if we can point back to restoration in the watershed, that broadly would trigger a success for us. There are, again, different ways that you can look at communicating that, gathering that data. And definitely don't underestimate the power of qualitative or semi-quantitative methods to supplement the more quantitative methods. So photo point monitoring, again, is a really excellent thing to do for these projects and fairly easy. So I recommend that you guys take tons and tons of pictures and submit those back to us and share those to the public to show success over time. And then you may also look at doing a riparian health indices or walking the riparian area and doing a semi-quantitative analysis of what is there and where your riparian area falls in its health. For information and education activities specifically, which are required are a required component of 319 projects, you want to be sure that you specifically discuss how you're gauging whether those projects were effective. This is another great opportunity to think outside of the box and be creative. Some things, especially with newsletters, social media, some of these things will give you numbers. You can, if you're doing in person, you can look at attendance and things, but you're not limited to that too. So if there are other creative ways for you to gauge the success of your information and education, you can do that as well. All right. We're going to keep rocking and rolling. All right, so monitoring specifically. If you guys do decide to monitor, be sure to clearly think through why you are monitoring and state your objectives. Your objectives need to be very specific and specific to your project. Effectiveness monitoring absolutely should be an objective. And then you also want to think about, is it feasible to collect the information you need to meet your objectives? Will your results be conclusive? And is your scale appropriate for the project? You'll want to describe your monitoring strategy. So the number and location of sites, sampling frequency and timing, parameters, methods, quality assurance and quality control, qualifications of the sampler, the person sampling, and then how you're managing that data and reporting that data. So you may or may not decide that you're going to monitor for use support. BMP effectiveness monitoring for these projects is very important too. So if your goal is to just do BMP effectiveness monitoring, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there are methods that we can look at if you don't already have something in place to monitor for BMP effectiveness specifically. So if we look at use support specifically though, just know that you would be monitoring specifically per Wyoming method to determine if you're meeting the standard or not. You may not be there yet, but just focus on how you can monitor for effectiveness again. The best thing to do if you're considering use support monitoring is to talk to our assessment team, talk to me, and let's get kind of proactive in that discussion and figure out what areas we can collaborate on there so that we're getting our questions answered and our objectives are really clear. If you're doing a few BMPs at the HUC 12 level, but may have like 2 monitoring locations at the HUC 8 level, again, think about the scale. You may not see changes that way. So you may want to adjust your plan a little bit just to make sure that you're showing effectiveness again. Okay, so we're going to keep going. And I know I said, you guys, that we're going to be here until 11:30. After we get through 319, it's going to be pretty quick on 205J. We're going to take another question and answer break, but I'm going to try and keep enough time on the tail end for us to have some good discussion and question and answer time. Okay, so some more things to consider in your monitoring. Just note that if you are going to be monitoring, that a sampling and analysis plan and quality assurance project plan will need to be approved by DEQ before you can begin sampling. Not before you submit your proposal necessarily, but absolutely before you can begin sampling. We have to have a SAP and a QAP submitted and approved by DEQ before you can do that. Any data that you collect would need to be reported back to the DEQ by the end of the project. So please budget in time and money for those activities. You're able to do that. You can have a monitoring specific task and allocate funds there if you'd like. There are some statutes to familiarize yourselves with if you aren't already. So the big ones would be the statute on trespassing to collect data, the specific number or the specific references there for you. And then the other one is the Wyoming Public Records Act, which is referenced there as well. So big things to note is that trespassing to collect data is illegal. So you always want to make sure you're getting the proper permissions on private property to collect data. And then any data that you do collect under a 319 or 205J project, are considered part of the project and are considered public records. So we definitely want to make sure that you submit that, but keep that into consideration too if you're based on where you are monitoring, if you want that data to be public record, if you're ready for that data to be public record or not. All right, so quickly, some information on estimating pollutant load reductions. The non-point source program as a whole is required to report on estimated pollutant load reductions for sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We also commonly get E. coli and selenium estimates. So those first three go into off to the EPA, and we will aggregate all project data, load reductions data together, and submit that to EPA on an annual basis. And then things like E. coli and selenium, we will include in our statewide annual progress report. So as you guys fill out annual progress reports for your projects, if you've submitted one in the past or completed one in the past, you'll know that that's something that you submit with every annual report. So those get aggregated together and sent off into one of those two buckets. So if you implement BMPs, just know that you will be required to report estimated pollutant load reductions at the end of your project. So you can do that throughout the life of the project on the annual report, which is recommended. But when it comes to close the project out, a requirement of this 319 grant is to submit those estimated load reductions. If you can, including estimated pollutant load reductions in your proposal helps communicate measurable, tangible outcomes to the task force. That's why it's bolded. This is something that they like seeing. So if you are able to do that, I highly recommend. And again, it's ideal if your load reduction estimates are based on water quality data, but they don't have to be. Sometimes modeling or other methods may also be appropriate. So I can help determine that if we need to. For example, here's some ideas for modeling tools. We very commonly use the Step L tool or the spreadsheet tool for estimating pollutant load. Basically what this does is employ simple algorithms to calculate nutrient and sediment loads from different land uses and the load reductions that would result from the implementation of various BMPs. And if you aren't familiar with Step L, there is a training on the EPA website that I highly recommend. It walks you through how to download the model or the tool, and then also how to use the tool and interpret the data on the back end or what data spit out. Other options for stream restoration projects may be cross sections or as-built surveys, fish surveys, and then several common Rosgen methods, so banks or bank assessment for non-point source consequences of sediment, or BHI, bank erosion hazard index, or NBS, near bank stress may all be tools that you may consider in your toolbox. These will help indicate what the benefits are for your projects. And then with Rosgen, they would give you load reduction estimates and environmental pollutant reductions over time. All right, some other ideas are listed here. Specific on the DEQ septic system model, this is a really simple spreadsheet model that you're welcome to use. It calculates load reduction for E. coli, nitrogen, and phosphorus for septic system projects. And I have access to that and can send it to anybody who doesn't already have it and may need it. All right, so what do we do at the end of the project? This is a question that is commonly asked by the task force. Do you have a plan to stay in touch with this project after it's completed? So in the project evaluation section of your application, you'll want to briefly describe how you'll commit to BMP operation and maintenance over time to ensure that the practices that you're putting in are effective. And this is typically done just for a reasonable lifetime or reasonable lifespan of the project. BMP follow-up monitoring is strongly recommended, but it's not required. You won't get bonus points, but I will say that it's something that the task force really likes to see, because again, it shows that you're committed to the project for a reasonable lifespan of the practice that you're submitting or putting in, and can give you success. You know, we talked about a little bit ago that sometimes it takes a really long time to see water quality data that supports showing that there's been a water quality improvement. So doing follow-up monitoring can be really helpful, because you'll kind of see over time after the project is completed if there has been a water quality improvement. All right, so this page for partnerships, this is a big one that the task force will focus on. They want to know that you've looked into other grant opportunities, that you have identified the right people and brought them to the table, so your stakeholders are all involved for the project. They'll want to know if you're actively looking for other funding sources for the project. And then when you're writing this out, be sure to include any kind of service or in-kind, and then also financial contributions that you may already know about. So for example, if Wyoming Game and Fish is going to be a partner, you'll want to write that out. And then under contributions, if you have a dollar amount, you can list it there, or else you can say something along the lines of technical assistance to complete monitoring for the project, or something along those lines. It does differ. Again, it doesn't have to be a cash contribution. It can be in kind, anything that anybody's contributing to the project, listed out here. And then moving on to the outreach and education section, note that it's not required per se. It is highly recommended though. Outreach and education is a critical component to garnering support and awareness for your project, and typically can lead to further implementation, further funding opportunities. There's a lot of reasons why you may want to consider having a solid outreach and education component. So consider how you can get the word out about your project and about improving water quality, again, increasing that awareness aspect. How can you encourage others to be involved? So if you're looking at doing a cleanup or a volunteer project on site, whatever it may be, you can think outside of the box here. You can learn from past experiences and be as creative as you want to be here. Especially in light of COVID and how that, changed a lot of our outreach last year and this year. There's opportunities to get creative here, and the task force, I think, will appreciate that too. So keep that in mind. And then looking at past project history, basically what you're trying to do here is give the task force confidence that you have the ability to manage the grant funds. If you haven't had a past 319 project, describe maybe other projects you've done. It doesn't have to be a 319 project, but definitely list it if you have done one. But again, we're just looking for confidence that you can manage the grant funds specifically. So any questions there, please let me know. So looking at the Greater Sage Grouse Court Area Protection, again, this is per agreement with the Game and Fish Department. We do ask whether you are in a Sage Grouse Court area or not. So that's a required checkbox. If you are, then you would need to get a consultation letter from Game and Fish and include that with your application. So we highly recommend you guys to contact Game and Fish early on in the process. Go ahead and get that part done soon, as quickly as you can. And then you would just want to include that letter in your application. So on your slide, you'll see if you have land disturbing activity in a core area, it is a requirement for you to obtain a consultation letter. If you're not sure, go ahead and contact them and try and get that determined. Okay, so like I mentioned before, in the other information section, this is basically an opportunity for you to talk about what else you want us to know about the project. If there's anything outstanding that hasn't been covered in the rest of the application, here's your chance to describe that to us. Okay, so special considerations. Big thing here is please be sure to read through the entirety of the memo for the RFP. These special considerations are outlined in more detail there. For irrigation BMP specifically, make sure you read through those requirements. For septic systems, there are eligibility criteria for remediating septic systems with Section 319 funds. So there's a link there to that document, but just be sure that you are aware of what those limitations look like prior to submitting for submitting your application. And then for microbial source tracking, again, there's more information there specific to Section 319 projects. All right, so for your budget, you have several different rows here to complete. These are estimates, of course, but we want to try and get it as close as possible to what you estimate needing. This first one, Section A, is going to be how much money you're asking for. Section B is how much non-federal match will you provide. As a reminder, for Section 319, it's a minimum of 40% required non-federal match. That can be in-kind or cash match, as a reminder. Then you'll want to add those up in Section C. And then in Section D, this is where you have the option, keyword option, to note any federal funds that will be contributed to the project. It's not required that you give us that information, but if you want to give a better idea of the entire budget for the project, you're more than welcome to include it there. And then in Section E, you'll just want to add up basically C and D to get an entire total project cost. And then just some notes on non-federal match. It's exactly what it sounds like. Any match in kind or cash that you plan to use cannot be federally provided. So no federal funds can be counted towards match. You can, however, count state funds, private funds, and landowner contributions, cash or in kind. They must be accrued during the same time frame of your 319 project, basically after you have a signed cooperative agreement, plus up to 60 days prior. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there for you to start accruing match prior to having an active project. So at least 40% again of the total project cost must be non-federal match. As example, if you're awarded $60,000 of Section 319 funds, you would have, or that would account for 60% of your total project cost. So $40,000 would be needed for non-federal match, which makes your total project cost $100,000. A really quick and easy way to calculate your minimum would be to divide your requested 319 amount by 1.5. So as you can see, if the award or your requested amount is 60,000, you divide that by 1.5, and then that gives you your 40,000 or your 40%. So there's a couple resources for non-federal match. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gives occupational employment statistics on an annual basis. The updated one has been, or the last one updated was released in May 2020. If you don't have a standard rate, or if your partner doesn't have a standard rate for the project, you can go onto that website and kind of browse and find as close as you can, that occupation, and it'll give you a statistical amount or an average amount to bill for that. I think it's at an hourly rate. And then for volunteer time in the independent sector, currently for 2021, it's $28.54 per hour for in-kind time. And that does change. So there's a link here if you wanted to double check that over time. Okay, so in your budget justification, the big things to note is that for each section, you'll want to provide a brief budget justification for each section and for each cost category. There are 4 cost categories. You have personnel, labor, supplies and equipment, contractual, and other. And then we also have kind of 3 buckets for each category. So we've got the 319 funds. That's where those are the funds that you'll be requesting. And then you'll have a bucket for non-federal match funds. Cash and in kind go into there. And then if you choose to report non-federal match, you can split it out by the cost categories as well. So it's really important to be sure to give a very brief but solid justification for each of these costs. Again, we will go into more specifics should you be recommended for funding, but the task force will pay attention here as well, or pay closer attention here as well, and may have questions for you specific to your budget. Another important thing to note is that if you think you may need equipment purchases, which are defined as personal property with a lifespan of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more, those need to be reviewed and approved by the DEQ and the EPA prior to purchase. So just keep that in mind as you're going through. And then again, that's just circling those buckets and showing you the different cost categories. And then we're going to move on. Okay, so administrative costs are limited. If you're recommended for funding, we will work with you again to more fully outline the project tasks and complete a project budget justification. The first task will be and will always be for every project administration. So this includes things like grants management, reporting, budget tracking, any indirect costs associated with the project, etc. Right now, we don't need to get into too much detail there, but just note that the administrative costs will be limited to not exceed 10% of the total 319 funding award, and 10% of the total project amount. So in the last example, where we had $60,000 of an award, the maximum amount is $6,000 that can be used for administration. And then if you think about the total project cost, it would be $10,000. All right. Okay, so this is the page where you're going to certify everything is there. You'll want to read through and check off those items to make sure you have them all. Read through everything and make sure that you understand all of the statements. But if you have questions, give me a call. At the bottom there, you'll want to sign and date the, I think really just one hard copy. So only one hard copy needs to have the original signature that you send to me. And then all of the other copies will have can just have the scanned signature. And so I thought we had walked through some of this together, but I may have missed a slide. So in there, you'll see that we would need 14 stapled hard copies of the signed application form, project maps, and the Sage Grouse Court area consultation letter, mailed or postmarked by the due date, which is Friday, September 10th, 2021 by 5 p.m. Again, you only need to have one hard copy with the original signature. All the other ones can have a scanned signature. And then you'll also want to, by that same time, 5 p.m. on September 10th, we'll want to submit an electronic copy of all of the items. So the application form, the maps, and the Sage Grouse Core Area consult letter. Email those to me. And then the only thing to note there is the electronic copy does not have to have a signature on it. If you've already gotten it uploaded or whatever with the scanned signature, that's totally fine though. I'll take it either way. And with that, we'll kind of pause for brief questions and then hop into 205J. And feel free to unmute yourself if you have questions. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but I'll keep monitoring the chat in case you do have questions. But we'll keep rocking and rolling. We've got a little under 15 minutes left. And for 205J, a lot of the application materials are going to look exactly the same. So I'm going to run through this one fairly quickly. But again, if I'm going too fast or you have questions, please let me know. So for section 205J, this grant is planning only, water quality management planning. There's no on-the-ground work. So any planning, monitoring, assessment, feasibility studies, et cetera, are generally eligible to apply for this grant. Only local planning only local planning agencies are eligible to apply. So specifically cities, counties, towns, and conservation districts. So this one's very limited in who can apply. Unfortunately, not nonprofits or individuals, those types of organizations will not be eligible for this. Every year we have a set $40,000 available for projects. And the limitations on this one primarily are that, again, it can't be used to meet monitoring requirements of any enforcement, permit, or regulation. Again, projects on impaired water bodies are priority. It is also reimbursement only, but you'll note that the non-federal match component is less. It's 25% of the total project cost for 205J. For 319, it was the 40%, 205J is 25%. All right, so what do you need to submit for a 205J proposal? You will need the application form and the project maps. Just as same as 319, we don't need to see any other attachments like the budget workbook or letters of support. And note that if you are recommended for funding, we'll go through that project implementation plan and budget justification process together. All right, and then the application form itself is a 7-page fillable PDF form. Again, please don't modify the format. You will want to download and use Adobe Reader for this one as well. And you'll want to download the document and save it onto your computer prior to editing and saving. If you're a Mac user, be sure to open it with Adobe and not Preview. All right, so the first page, same guidance for 319. There is a specific 205J memorandum that you can refer to as well. But as you can see, it looks very similar. Same thing on this next page. You're going through the pollutants that you're addressing, the time frame, your project purpose, and your project scope. The only thing to note here that's different is that your time frame is going to be shorter for 205J. These grants are shorter and projects are limited to 2 years maximum. These projects will need to be completed by April 1st, 2024 for the FY22 RFP. All right, and then for outcomes, evaluation, and partnerships, same thing for 205J as for 319. Please be as specific as you can, but try and limit it within the space that you're provided. For project outcomes, again, it's really important to be specific in your outcomes and show what you will do in the future with the project outcomes. So you're not implementing a project as part of 319, but that, as part of 205J, But with that said, the project should have some contribution to a future goal of implementation. So what are you going to do with the results that you gather with 205J? All right, and then this next one goes through again, components of monitoring, past project history, and then any other information that you think is important but was not covered in another section, you can add in here too. In your water quality monitoring, again, it's really, really important. Please clearly think through your monitoring objectives and state those as specifically as possible. Try and work through it until you can get that objective fairly specific and reasonable. We really want to avoid a really broad objective. We want to make sure that we can measure success based off of that objective. Okay, and then for the budget component, it's outlined just the same as with the 319 application. So you can refer to that same guidance and then note again that only 25% of the total project cost will be for non-federal match. To calculate 25% of non-federal match, all you would need to do is divide your requested amount by 3. So if you're requesting $40,000, you would just divide that by 3 to get your non-federal match, and then you'll add those two up and that would be your total project cost. And if you need a reminder of that, please let me know. Totally fine to reach out and ask. All right, and then same with the budget justification, the same 10% limits on administrative costs apply to 205J grants as well. And then you'll have the same certification and signature checklist. Again, we'll need the 14 hard copies. Only one needs the original signature, but you'll need to mail those or postmark them by 5 p.m. on September 10th, 2021. And then you will also want to email me an electronic copy of all of your application materials by 5 p.m. on Friday, September 10th as well. So with that said, we're going to pause for questions. If you don't have any, we'll keep going. Okay, I'm going to keep monitoring the chat. Feel free to type them in, and if I don't snag them while we're walking through the rest of the presentation, we'll touch back on them at the end. Okay, so to submit your proposal and then what occurs next, let's see. So submitting your proposal, you'll want to make, again, those 14 hard copies of your application packet. For 319, that'll be the application, the maps, and then the Sage Grouse consultation letter, if applicable. For 205J, it's simply the application form and the maps, and then that's it. There's nothing else that you need to submit to us. You may print your maps in color if you choose to. It's really helpful if they are in color for the task force. Everything else for your application can be in black and white. Again, only one hard copy needs an original signature. The rest can be scanned copies. And then the electronic version does not need a signature. And then what you're going to want to do is staple each packet together. Instead of using like a cover or any other bindings, simply just staple each packet together and then put them all in an envelope and mail them off to me no later than 5 p.m. September 10th, 2021. The mailing address is in the memos, but if you need it, feel free to give me a call. Same goes for the electronic copy in terms of the deadline. And please send those to me in PDF form if you can. Basically, that makes it to where we don't run any risk of it being edited. And then once I receive everything, both the hard copies and the electronic copy, I'll send you a confirmation email. So after you receive that confirmation email, I'm reviewing those proposals. I will go through them all, prepare comments on each one, and provide those proposals and comments to the task force members for their review. I'll also send my comments back to you as the sponsor so that you can have time to adjust anything for your presentation. Something new this year for both grants is that we're going to try giving the task force the opportunity to provide comments prior to your presentation too, so that you can hear from them and from me. We're still working out the kinks on that, but I do hope to have it leveled out so that you can have comments from everybody. And then after that, you'll have the opportunity to present your project to the task force at the fall 2021 meeting. That date and location is to be determined, but you will be made aware as soon as possible. The task force will use an evaluation form to score each section 319 and 205J proposal. That would be the written and the presentation. And then just know that the presentation is a really good opportunity to explain firsthand why your project is important and should be funded. Really focus on answering the questions and the comments that we provide to you. It's not required that you kind of give us a rehash of your application. It's actually preferred that you spend more time addressing comments and questions and giving further detail from your application. Basically, you want to be sure to fill in any gaps at that time for the task force. And then once we've listened to all of the presentations, the task force will have a discussion and recommend all the projects for funding right there at the fall meeting. If you're recommended for funding, I'll work with you to complete a PIP and a more detailed project budget. And then once we get those funds released from the federal government, we'll work together to get an agreement set up and signed so that you can start your project. The big thing to note is that a project is not active until a signed agreement is in place. And once we have the signed agreement, I'll be sure to let you know. So this is what the Section 319 evaluation form looks like. So this is what I'll fill out. It's really important to pay attention to that additional information box. That's where my comments and suggestions will go. And then this is what your scoring matrix looks like that the task force will fill out. So you can see they have a bunch of different elements that they'll review and you'll receive a weighted score from. And then new to this year, again, is that area for them to provide additional comments back to the sponsor. So we're going to work hard to get that piece done this year, but if we're not able to get it done this year, we're going to work on integrating it into future RFPs. Okay, so these are the evaluation criteria. We won't go through all of them, but the red are the top priorities. So again, we want to see that the project addresses an important water quality need for the state and that the project is designed to effectively address that need. And then we also want to see that the project involves appropriate partners and has significant stakeholder support. So you want to be sure that you're reaching out to your stakeholders and getting them involved in the project early on. As part of that, we'll be sure to note that adequate non-federal match has been secured for the project, and the match sources are appropriate for the project. And then the green are going to be the medium priorities. So we want to make sure that we see that planning has taken place. You're focused on measurable outcomes. The project costs are reasonable. And then the project includes methods to evaluate program or project effectiveness. Lower priority, but still important, will be outreach and education. Sufficient technical and managerial resources are available. So we're making sure that you guys have what you need to get the project done effectively. And that the project will promote long-term and self-maintaining natural, ecological, and social processes. So that's really important. And then we want to see that the project is timely and efficient. And then finally, we want to see if there are other resources that are benefited: wildlife, fisheries, soil health, water conservation, those types of things. If they are benefited, be sure to call that out too. So all of that information is available on the website in the grant resources section, and it's called the FY21 Section 319 Proposal Review Guidelines, and you'll see all the questions that they go through. Okay, and then with 205J, it's the same evaluation process. The evaluation sheet looks pretty much the same. You'll have an area for additional information for my comments. And then again, on the task force, scoring matrix, they will have a new additional comments space on there too. So less elements than the 319 scoring sheet, since it is primarily planning only for this grant, but you will still get a weighted score and opportunity to review comments from the task force. A really great resource would be looking at the annual report from last year. There's a link here, but I can send it out to you. This is a really great place, especially if you're new to the program, to see some good examples of what was competitive last year, what received funding, and what types of projects are more commonly funded. So with that said, I am going to conclude my portion of the presentation. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask now. Otherwise, there will be a brief period over the next week or two where you can send any questions to me. After that, I can't guarantee that we'll be able to walk through specifics, but I am here as a resource if you need me. So feel free to unmute yourself if you have some questions, or throw them in the chat, or you can email them to me. All right. Well, again, I really appreciate you guys for taking the time to participate today, to listen in on the presentation. This will be available as a recording here soon. When it does go up, we will send out a listserv notice. So be sure to join our listserv if you haven't yet. And yeah, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with this year, and hope you all have a great rest of your week. And we will talk soon. Thank you all.